We've all imagined what it would be like to live in a post-apocalyptic world. And you know what? It's just such an interesting topic to think and talk about. So, I've decided to list everything people get wrong about nuclear apocalypses, starting with one people overlook: total extinction. The biggest lie is that nuclear war means humanity's complete erasure, every person vaporized or doomed within hours. Reality paints a darker but survivable picture. A full-scale US-Russia exchange would kill hundreds of millions instantly through blasts and firestorms, with billions more dying from famine and radiation caused by nuclear winter. But humans in non-targeted areas, especially the southern hemisphere, would likely survive the initial strikes and fallout. The key is distance from ground zero and basic shelter. A basement can block 90% of radiation exposure during the critical first weeks. Limited regional conflicts, like a hypothetical India-Pakistan nuclear exchange using 100 warheads, would devastate those nations but spare most of the globe from direct effects. Studies show temperatures might drop 5 degrees Celsius regionally, causing crop failures and mass starvation, yet not ending all human life. Even Hiroshima and Nagasaki prove recovery is possible. Cities rebuilt within years, despite the horror. The apocalypse would be catastrophic beyond imagination, wiping out modern civilization as we know it, but total extinction is unlikely, unless every warhead on Earth detonates perfectly to maximize casualties. So if instant death isn't guaranteed, what actually wipes out most survivors? The answer has nothing to do with radiation and everything to do with what happens to the sky itself. This is where fiction finally got something half right, just not in the way you think. Movies love showing ash-covered skies and frozen landscapes, treating nuclear winter like an aesthetic choice for post-apocalypse settings. But the reality is so much more specific and terrifying than a generic Ice Age backdrop. Here's what actually happens in the hours after a major exchange. Firestorms from burning cities create their own weather systems, generating winds up to 300 miles per hour that feed flames with fresh oxygen. These aren't normal fires you can outrun or extinguish. They're self-sustaining infernos that consume everything combustible in targeted urban areas, and the heat is so intense it creates updrafts powerful enough to punch through the troposphere. All that burning material, millions of tons of soot and ash from vaporized buildings, vehicles, and human remains, gets injected directly into the stratosphere where normal weather patterns can't wash it out. The soot spreads globally within weeks, carried by high-altitude winds that circle the planet. Sunlight that normally delivers about 1,000 watts per square meter to Earth's surface drops to a fraction of that, and this is where the famine equation becomes unavoidable. Modern agriculture depends on predictable growing seasons with specific temperature ranges and sunlight duration. Drop temperatures even 5 degrees Celsius during critical growing months, and crop yields collapse by 70 to 90%. Rice paddies in Asia, wheat fields in North America, corn in South America, all these fail simultaneously because the same atmospheric currents that spread the soot create global cooling effects. A full-scale US-Russia war could put 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere, enough to drop temperatures 10 to 20 degrees Celsius in some regions. The growing season in the northern hemisphere might shrink from 6 months to 2 months, and that 2-month window happens during the cooler, darker post-strike period when photosynthesis barely functions. Now here's where nuclear winter gets really interesting, and where the debates among scientists reveal how much uncertainty still exists. Early models from the 1980s, the ones that scared an entire generation, assumed worst-case scenarios for everything. They calculated based on Cold War arsenals twice the size of current stockpiles, targeting strategies designed for maximum civilian casualties, and assumed every warhead hit a city center during dry conditions perfect for firestorms. But those models had problems that later studies exposed. Modern simulations factor in variables the early ones ignored. Not all targets are cities. Many warheads hit military installations in rural areas where there's less fuel for firestorms. Weather conditions matter hugely. Detonations during wet seasons or in winter produce fewer fires, and less soot. The type of construction matters too. Modern cities with more concrete and steel generate different smoke profiles than the wood-heavy cities of the 1980s. Some researchers now argue that even a large exchange might produce a severe nuclear autumn rather than a multi-year winter, with temperatures dropping 5 to 10 degrees Celsius for months rather than decades. This isn't good news. That still causes massive famines, but it's not the permanent ice age that fiction depicts. The real scientific fight is over regional nuclear wars and how much cooling they cause. A war between India and Pakistan using 115 kiloton weapons, small by modern standards, could still inject enough soot to drop global temperatures 1 to 2 degrees Celsius for 5 years, according to Rutgers University studies. That sounds minor until you realize it drops food production 20 to 30% worldwide, triggering famines in countries nowhere near the conflict. Other scientists dispute these numbers, arguing the models overestimate fire sizes and soot injection injection heights. The truth is, we don't know for certain because we've never actually tested it at scale, and that uncertainty is itself terrifying. We're gambling with billions of lives based on computer models that disagree about fundamental outcomes. Contagious fallout. One of the weirdest misconceptions is that radioactive fallout spreads like a zombie virus, infecting people who then contaminate others in an endless chain. Games like Fallout accidentally reinforce this by showing irradiated wastelands centuries later, as if radiation never fades. Fallout is radioactive particles, dust and debris sucked up by the mushroom cloud and scattered by wind, not some contagious plague. It decays rapidly through natural half-lives, with many dangerous isotopes like iodine-131 dropping to safe levels within weeks because its half-life is only 8 days. Cesium-137 sticks around longer at 30 years, but even that becomes background level eventually. Shelter in place for the first 48 hours, and you avoid the worst exposure. Then you can emerge as particles settle and decay. Fallout doesn't jump from person to person. You can't catch radiation sickness by touching a survivor. The persistent wastelands in fiction ignore how wind patterns and detonation height limit fallout spread. High-altitude bursts produce less ground contamination than surface explosions. Hiroshima and Chernobyl both recovered to habitable radiation levels. People live in those areas today without glowing in the dark. Plutonium gets hyped as eternal doom, but it's actually less immediately toxic than caffeine gram for gram, dangerous mainly if you inhale or ingest alpha particles. Radioactive waste from bombs and reactors does take thousands of years to reach natural or toxicity, but that's different from acute fallout after strikes. But wait, if radiation fades that fast, why does every post-apocalypse story show mutants roaming wastelands centuries later? Turns out there's a reason fiction obsesses over mutations, and it's not because radiation actually works that way. The real story is way darker and way less exciting than Godzilla ever showed you. Radiation kills cells by breaking molecular bonds in DNA, creating mutations at the genetic level. Your body has repair mechanisms that fix most of this damage, but high doses overwhelm those systems. When enough cells die, you get radiation sickness. When cells survive with corrupted DNA, you get cancer years later as those damaged cells replicate out of control. When reproductive cells get damaged, you can pass genetic defects to children, causing birth defects or developmental problems. This is documented in Hiroshima and Chernobyl survivors, elevated cancer rates, and heritable genetic damage that affects generations. It's absolutely horrible, but it's not dramatic. It's not visible mutations that turn people into ghouls or super mutants. The idea of beneficial or empowering mutations is biologically nonsensical. Evolution works through mutations? Sure, but beneficial ones are rare and take generations to spread through populations. A mutation that randomly occurs in one person's cells doesn't grant superpowers. It either kills those cells, causes disease, or does nothing at all. The X-Men fantasy of radiation unlocking latent abilities has zero basis in biology. Even Godzilla's origin story as a creature mutated by nuclear testing plays on 1950s fears without any scientific mechanism. Real mutations from radiation look like cancer, birth defects, and shortened lifespans, not giant monsters or telepathic abilities. What makes the mutation myth particularly dangerous is it distracts from real radiation health effects. People worry about glowing zombies when they should worry about thyroid cancer clusters downwind of test sites. The US conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests in Nevada and the Pacific, exposing thousands of soldiers and civilians to fallout. These downwinders have elevated cancer rates decades later. Unglamorous, but real harm. The myth makes radiation seem fantastical when the actual threat is prosaic long-term illness. If you are enjoying the video so far and want to discuss or get mad at me for my rankings, join my Discord, link in the description. Mutant powers. Radiation in movies grants superpowers or creates giant monsters, Godzilla rising from atomic tests, or Fallout's mutants gaining strength and immortality. This myth makes radiation seem almost magical, transforming victims into something new. Real radiation just breaks your DNA and kills cells, causing cancer, birth defects, and radiation sickness. Nothing cool or useful. Survivors of Hiroshima and Chernobyl faced leukemia, thyroid cancer, and genetic damage passed to children. Horrible outcomes, but not monstrous transformations. The idea of beneficial mutations is pure fantasy. Radiation damages randomly, and the body either repairs it or suffers. You won't grow extra limbs or gain telepathy. You'll just get sick and possibly die. Man-made radiation is identical to natural background radiation from rocks and cosmic rays, about 2 to 3 millisieverts per year for most people. Higher doses overwhelm cellular repair, with 500 rem acutely proving fatal to half of exposed humans. Fiction loves the mutant angle because it's visual and dramatic, turning invisible danger into visible threats, like the ghouls and super mutants populating post-nuclear wastelands. But biology doesn't work that way. Mutations that that don't kill you outright still don't grant powers. Chernobyl studies showed increased health problems, not X-Men style abilities. Forget biological threats for a second. There's one effect from nuclear weapons that actually does destroy something permanently, and it's not what you think. One bomb detonated in the right place could send an entire nation back to the Stone Age without killing a single person directly. At least, that's what the movies want you to believe. The electromagnetic pulse from nuclear weapons has become the apocalypse scenario for the digital age. The idea that our dependence on technology makes us uniquely vulnerable to an attack that doesn't even need to hit the ground. Let's break down what an EMP actually is, because the physics matter for understanding why the myths exist. When a nuclear weapon detonates, it releases gamma rays in all directions. In a normal ground or low altitude burst, these gamma rays are absorbed by the atmosphere and ground within miles. But detonate a warhead at high altitude, above 30 kilometers, and those gamma rays travel downward through thin atmosphere until they hit denser air. When they collide with air molecules, they knock electrons loose through a process called Compton scattering. These free electrons spiral around Earth's magnetic field lines, creating a massive current pulse that radiates outward. This is the E1 pulse, a nanosecond spike of electromagnetic energy that can induce voltage surges in any conductor it hits. The Starfish Prime test in 1962 proved EMPs are real. The US detonated a 1.4 megaton warhead 400 kilometers above the Pacific, and the resulting EMP knocked out streetlights in Hawaii 900 miles away, damaged telephone systems, and triggered burglar alarms. But here's what the test also proved. The effects were inconsistent. Some systems failed while identical systems nearby kept working. The EMP coupled more strongly with certain conductor orientations and lengths, acting like a chaotic antenna effect rather than a uniform death ray. This is the key detail fiction ignores. EMPs are stochastic, meaning they're probabilistic, not deterministic. Modern EMP scenarios extrapolate from Starfish Prime to catastrophic levels. A warhead optimized for EMP detonated over Kansas could theoretically affect the entire continental United States, inducing voltages in power lines that fry transformers, and telecommunications cables that destroy switches, and computer systems that corrupt data. The worst-case scenario has the entire electrical grid collapsing, transformers burning out beyond repair, taking months or years to manufacture replacements. Without power, water systems fail, hospitals can't function, fuel can't be pumped, supply chains collapse. It's civilization ending without direct casualties, which makes it tempting for fiction because you get apocalypse aesthetics without the moral weight of billions of corpses. But the worst case assumes everything fails simultaneously, and real-world testing shows otherwise. Military systems are hardened against EMP using Faraday cages and surge protection, so they survive. Many civilian systems are partially protected accidentally. Buried cables and shielded enclosures provide some defense. The power grid has circuit breakers designed to isolate surges. Not perfectly, but enough to prevent total cascade failures. And here's the thing nobody talks about. EMPs are a one-time pulse, not continuous radiation. Once it passes, undamaged electronics work fine. Repairing the grid means replacing specific failed components, not rebuilding from scratch. The real EMP risk is more limited and specific. A high-altitude burst could cause regional blackouts lasting days to weeks as utilities identify and replace damaged transformers. Communication systems might fragment as cell towers lose power. Some vehicles would stall if their ignition systems caught the pulse wrong, but many would drive fine. It's a serious disruption, potentially costing thousands of lives indirectly through infrastructure failure, but it's not permanent Stone Age regression. The myth comes from conflating possible damage with certain damage, and extrapolating worst-case scenarios as inevitable outcomes. Total EMP blackout. Movies like Broken Arrow show nuclear EMPs frying every electronic device across entire continents instantly, leaving survivors in a tech-free Stone Age. The fear is one high-altitude detonation plunges the whole country into permanent darkness. EMPs from high-altitude nuclear explosions, called hains, do generate powerful electromagnetic pulses that can damage unshielded electronics, but the effects are stochastic and variable, not a guaranteed kill switch. A hain detonated above the US would create voltage surges in power grids and communications, potentially causing widespread blackouts. Yet, not every device fails uniformly. Hardened military systems and many civilian electronics and Faraday cage-like structures survive, and distance from the burst point matters hugely. The Starfish Prime test in 1962 knocked out streetlights in Hawaii 900 miles away, proving EMP is real, but it didn't destroy all technology permanently. Modern grids have some protections, and repairs would take months, not decades. Low altitude or surface bursts produce weaker EMPs because the blast and heat dominate, EMPs require specific high-altitude detonations to maximize. The myth of total tech wipeout ignores how probabilistic electrical damage is. Some cars stall, while others drive fine. Prepping with basic surge protection and keeping older mechanical backups helps, but it's not the instant Stone Age scenario fiction loves. Okay, so you can survive the blast, outlast the winter, avoid the fallout, and keep some tech running. At this point, you're thinking, how has this not happened already? Why haven't the bombs dropped if it's this survivable? The answer is the most dangerous myth on this entire list, and it's the one that defense experts lose sleep over. Nuclear deterrence. The idea that possessing nuclear weapons prevents others from attacking you has become such accepted wisdom that questioning it feels naive. But the historical record shows deterrence is neither as effective nor as stable as the myth suggests. Foolproof deterrence. The Cold War narrative sold nuclear deterrence as a perfect shield, mutual assured destruction keeping superpowers from ever fighting because launching means suicide. It's portrayed as a stable system that always works. History shows deterrence is neither foolproof nor safe, relying on luck and rational actors every single time forever. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 nearly triggered nuclear war through miscalculation, and it was dumb luck that a Soviet submarine officer refused to launch torpedoes. Nuclear powers have lost wars to non-nuclear states, the US in Vietnam and the Soviets in Afghanistan, without using their arsenals, because deterrence didn't compel victory. Deterrence didn't stop Russia from invading Ukraine in 2022, despite NATO's nuclear umbrella, or Pakistan from the Kargil incursion against India in 1999. It only works if all leaders act rationally all the time, but human error, technical glitches, and misperceptions create endless near-miss scenarios. Deterrence is also aggressive, enabling threats and coercion like Russia warning countries not to aid Ukraine or face nuclear consequences. Most countries reject nuclear weapons. 122 nations signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, showing deterrence is a minority pursuit. The myth that nukes kept the peace ignores other factors like European integration and economic ties. Deterrence has held so far, but calling it 100% effective dismisses the terrifying near misses that could have ended civilization. The deterrence myth has several layers. The first is that nuclear weapons prevented World War III between the United States and Soviet Union. This assumes that without nukes, they definitely would have fought, and the weapons were the only restraint. But correlation isn't causation. The post-World War II order included other massive changes: the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, economic integration through Marshall Plan aid, the establishment of the United Nations, and growing trade relationships that made war economically catastrophic. Europe had just finished destroying itself twice in 30 years. There was no appetite for a third round regardless of nuclear weapons. Attributing peace solely to deterrence ignores all these other factors that made conventional war between superpowers unthinkable. The second layer is that deterrence always works when both sides have nuclear weapons. Historical near misses demolish this claim. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the world came within hours of nuclear war, not because either leader wanted it, but because of miscommunication and pressure from military advisors. Soviet submarines near Cuba, out of contact with Moscow and under harassment from US destroyers, nearly launched nuclear torpedoes. The decision not to launch required unanimous agreement from 3 officers, and one of them, Vasily Arkhipov, refused authorization. One man's judgment prevented escalation. That's not deterrence working, that's dumb luck. In 1983, Soviet early warning systems detected what appeared to be 5 US ICBMs launching toward Moscow. Protocol required immediate retaliation, and the officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, had minutes to decide. He concluded it was a false alarm, computer glitches from satellite sensors catching sunlight reflections, and chose not to report it up the chain of command. Again, one person's intuition prevented a nuclear war that deterrence theory said couldn't happen accidentally. These aren't the only near misses either. The Damascus Titan II explosion in 1980, the Norwegian rocket incident in 1995 where Russia almost launched thinking they were under attack, the 1979 NORAD error where a training tape simulating Soviet attack fed into live systems. Deterrence didn't prevent escalation in these cases, individual humans betting against their orders did. The third layer is that nuclear powers never lose wars to non-nuclear states, because the threat of escalation deters defeat. Vietnam dismantled this myth. The United States, with thousands of nuclear warheads, lost to North Vietnam, which had 0. The Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan despite nuclear superiority. Nuclear weapons provide no advantage in asymmetric conflicts where the political goals don't justify escalation. You can't nuke guerrilla fighters without annihilating the country you're trying to control, which defeats the purpose. Deterrence proponents argue these wars were limited by choice. But that's the point. Nuclear weapons didn't prevent defeat. They just prevented the wars from going nuclear, which they were never going to anyway because the stakes didn't warrant it. The fourth layer, and this is where it gets scary, is that deterrence is defensive and stabilizing. Reality shows it's aggressive and destabilizing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 happened despite Ukraine's assurances of NATO support and NATO's collective nuclear arsenal. Deterrence didn't prevent invasion. Worse, Russia then used nuclear threats to deter NATO countries from providing certain weapons to Ukraine, warning that escalatory aid could trigger nuclear response. So nuclear weapons didn't prevent war, they enabled aggression by shielding the aggressor from full conventional response. Pakistan did the same thing during the Kargil conflict in 1999, infiltrating Indian territory while implying nuclear escalation if India retaliated too harshly. Deterrence becomes a tool of coercion, not just defense. The fifth layer is that deterrence only requires rational actors, and rationality is universal. This assumes all leaders process information correctly, have accurate intelligence, and value survival above other goals. History shows none of these are guaranteed. Leaders make decisions based on incomplete information, filtered through advisors with their own biases. The Iraq War started partly because US intelligence incorrectly assessed Saddam Hussein's weapons programs. Imagine similar errors with nuclear stakes. And rationality itself is culturally defined. What seems rational in Washington might seem reckless in Beijing or New Delhi. The assumption that everyone shares the same risk calculations is dangerously simplistic. Finally, deterrence assumes arsenals remain under perfect control forever. No accident, no rogue commanders, no technical failures that launch weapons without authorization. The sheer number of warheads, over 12,000 globally, creates constant risk. Every missile silo, every submarine, every bomber carrying nuclear weapons is a potential failure point. And these systems age, requiring maintenance and upgrades that introduce new vulnerabilities. The Titan II missiles in the US were decommissioned partly because they were becoming unsafe to maintain, leaking fuel and suffering explosions. How many current systems are nearing that point? How many near misses happen that we never hear about because they don't escalate? Deterrence isn't a physics law, it's a psychological gamble repeated every day, that everyone with access to nuclear weapons chooses not to use them. It's worked for 80 years. But survivorship bias makes us overconfident. The myth that deterrence is stable and reliable makes us complacent about the risks, and that complacency might be what finally breaks it. And here's the ultimate irony that connects everything we've covered. The myth that started it all, the story that made everyone believe nuclear weapons were necessary in the first place, was a lie from day one. Everything you learned in history class about why the atomic bomb was used, that comfortable narrative about saving lives and ending the war quickly. It's time to dismantle the founding mythology of the nuclear age. Because if the origin story is false, it calls into question every justification built on top of it. Bombs ended World War II. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are credited as the decisive blow forcing Japan's surrender, preventing a costly invasion and saving millions of lives. It's the foundational story justifying nuclear weapons as peacemakers. Evidence suggests the bombings were coincidental to Japan's surrender, with the Soviet Union's entry into the Pacific War on August 9, 1945, as the real trigger. Japanese leaders feared Soviet occupation of their northern territories more than American terms. Their defenses against Russia were weak, and the nightmare of a communist takeover loomed large. General Dwight Eisenhower believed Japan was already defeated and searching for surrender options, calling the bombs unnecessary. Military leaders dissented from the narrative that nukes were essential, viewing them as overkill. Declassified documents in books like Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's Racing the Enemy show the timing aligned with Soviet actions, not the bomb's unique horror. The myth persists because it justifies the weapon's existence and America's decision, shaping modern views on nuclear deterrence as a peacekeeping tool. Some speculate the bombs were demonstrations aimed at the Soviets to establish post-war dominance, a show of force rather than a necessity. Films like Oppenheimer blend history with myth-busting, showing creator regret and questioning the official story. The truth complicates the idea that nuclear weapons inherently prevent wars or end them cleanly. If you enjoyed this video and want to see everything people get wrong about zombie movies, click the video on the screen.